Good morning, everybody. It is an honor to be here, and hopefully the clicker will work for me. Okay, it's kind of working. So I just want to say that any views or opinions expressed here today by me do not necessarily reflect those of Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and these are my disclosures as well. I'm an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins. So picking up where Chris left off, we have a lot of products all under the Kratom umbrella, and again, for all the reasons he just stated, it really is important from a clinical and forensic toxicology standpoint to really define what we mean by Kratom, and I can't stress that we need a better taxonomy than we currently have, so that what I consider to be mainstream Kratom, like everything on here, I would draw a circle around this and say this is mainstream Kratom. This has all been around for a while. The products that Chris just mentioned, they are not on here for a reason, and I think it's just important to keep that in mind. Oh, this clicker is horrible. So, 2007, Kratom first is documented in the case report literature. Dr. Boyer will probably talk more about that. And this really did come at a time in which we had a convergence of crises: psychiatric health, pain, chronic pain, and then, of course, polydrug epidemic. And we still have these epidemics, right? This has not changed. But Kratom is part of this bigger story, and that people were looking for something. And many of the reason I got into this personally is meeting people in treatment settings who were really not getting their needs met. And they were looking for some alternative because the pharmaceutical industry and the medical industry was either not available or not helping them anymore. And so that's how I got into this. And if we fast forward to 2024, we see a lot of the same, and I'm going to talk about how the motivations have changed, but who is actually using now? Going back to the prevalence estimates briefly, we really don't have great prevalence estimates. We need a better range than we currently have, because I agree with Chris. I do think it's over 10 million. I don't know how many daily users there are, but it's certainly in the many millions. And for context, there are about 34 million cigarette smokers in America still, right? So many millions this is not niche as a marketplace. It is something that does require attention and regulation. Most people are in their mid-30s on average. It is used between men and women pretty equally, unlike Southeast Asia, where it's more males reporting use. And actually, the Kratom using population with respect to income, education, looks a lot like the general population. There might be some more health conditions among this population, but in many other ways, it's actually very, compared to some populations I've studied that use illicit drugs, this population is very diverse, and it doesn't look like just one thing, which I think is really interesting. Most people are using daily at this point, or they're using recreationally and occasionally, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Those who are using daily are typically using 2 to 4 times per day on average. And here is a bunch of stuff, right? It's a little overwhelming, but I want to walk you through some of this because it's the most granular data we have to date with respect to Kratom use patterns in the United States or globally. And what we did when I was still at NIDA is I led a study. Chris was actually a mentor on this. And we ended up doing what's called ecological momentary assessment, where we gathered across 357 participants, data at random and scheduled intervals on a study smartphone application. So we know when people wake up, we know when they go to sleep. Everything is very structured and standardized. And we had over 13,000 unique Kratom use events that were identified during this 15-day period. And we use those to do kind of an analysis to see, what are the patterns of use within this sample. And you can hopefully see, we have group A at the top. They're using most frequently, all the way down to group E, which is using the least frequently. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that you can't really see it, but these are the hours of the day spread out at the bottom of that graph. And what this is showing us is that most people, no matter how much they're actually using, are tending to use more during the first half of their waking hours. And this is important because what we didn't see was binge-like use or heavy late-night use or things like that. We see people using this the times of day when they actually are trying to be most productive. And we know people in the sample were employed or in school. So these are people who are living their lives actively and using this as part of their daily regimen. And I think that's going to be increasingly important to keep in mind as we go. This clicker is really just something else. Okay, so this is a curve that is based on all of these thousands and thousands of data points showing that across products, and I should say most products in the sample were whole leaf products, not all of them, that the time course of effects are peaking about at 1 hour. And we see this in the lab study. I have a clinical trial at Hopkins right now. We're seeing about the same thing. So this is not a substance in which you take it and it's lasting for 12 hours, and it's not something that you're taking and it lasts for 12 minutes, right? It has a very nice orderly time curve, and this is across multiple different doses. So it is kind of an average. It's not specific to a particular dose or product. This here is showing motivations for use, and these are proximal motivations in real time. So when we look at why are people using, not broadly, but in the moment, we see that analgesia, essentially pain-killing effects, are being sought out, but also, and this is really important, the stimulatory effects, so increasing mood, focus, productivity, energy. These are, again, what people would want as part of daily living, right? They're not necessarily wanting to feel, quote unquote, high or intoxicated, which I should say we did evaluate. We asked about that. And that did not even make it into this graph because it was not endorsed at a high enough rate. People do endorse wanting to feel good, which is very different than wanting to feel intoxicated or high. And I think that again, is an important point to keep in mind. So acute effects, so these are very much in keeping with what people are seeking out. Energized, focused, alertness. We see some people not experiencing any effects, but that's actually because we had a very long follow-up window, and so some of those acute effects had already peaked by the time we had gotten these follow-up data. But again, to emphasize stimulatory and analgesic effects at low and at high serving sizes. This is kind of an important finding because a lot of times people say lower doses are really for more stimulatory effects, and higher doses are for pain-killing effects. That's actually not what we're finding, both qualitatively and when we look at things like this. It really is. I think when you get to a certain serving size, you do have a slightly different thing, but that's over 12 or 13 grams, which not everyone is using that much. So instrumental use and compatibility with daily living. Again, this narrative of how is this fitting into a person's life. There's a lot of data I'm not showing. We know what people are doing when they're doing, what activities they're engaged in. So there's a ton of stuff I'm not showing. What this slide is showing is what we ask people at the end of the day for these 15 days, which is to reflect upon how did the Kratom effects you experienced this day fit within your daily roles and obligations? Were they helpful? Were they compatible? Were they a hindrance? And by and large, across all of our different groups, what we've seen here and what we've seen in another sample where we assess this is people are overwhelmingly saying that these Kratom products are not only compatible with their daily living, but also very helpful in them meeting their daily roles and obligations, which is part of this instrumental use thing. So people, like when I drink coffee this morning, that's instrumental use. And that first one, compatible and helpful, the way I like to really help people understand this is it is kind of like a cup of coffee. It is not only compatible, but it is helping me give this talk a little better than I would if I had not had my coffee. That second one there, where people endorse this is compatible, but it's not necessarily helpful, that's more like a glass of wine, right? Or a cocktail. I could have a drink at the end of the day. It's not incompatible with my life. It's not necessarily helpful either. So it's not a hindrance, and that's the big takeaway. What we've seen in almost all of the samples that we've assessed this in is it's not a hindrance, right? And we'll get into for some where it can be a hindrance, but by and large, it's not. I do want to touch on the harm reduction point just a minute, because this is how, in my estimate, one reason why Kratom was not scheduled in the first place. And I think that remembering the public benefit versus harm of this is not a trivial point. And so we know, and we've known for a while, even going back to Southeast Asia, people using Kratom products in the United States to attenuate withdrawal from many substances. And in this sample, people weren't doing that because they had already gotten off of those substances years ago. So we have people who've been using, in this sample, 93% have been using for more than a year. Some had been using over a decade. And we see that the group A who's taking kratom more frequently, not necessarily higher doses, but just more frequently. They were more likely than the other groups to be using as a long-term substitute for opioids. They were also more likely to perceive kratom as life-saving. They were also much more regimented in their patterns of use, which is what we see with a maintenance medication type regimen. I'm not calling kratom a medicine. I'm making no medical claims here. And I'm talking about products, not pharmaceuticals. So this is very much real-world use that people are adapting to their lifestyle and needs, whether it is for going and having a pre-workout kind of drink, which we know is also happening, or for this harm reduction. And they're not mutually exclusive. Many people are naming multiple reasons. So kratom physical dependence and addiction, I am, believe it or not, the world expert on kratom use disorder. Shockingly, there aren't many of us. Darshan Singh in Malaysia would be my Asian counterpart. And so what kratom use disorder is essentially DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for substance use disorder applied to kratom. And this is important because it's a very widely used assessment method. So I and colleagues have assessed this in this sample and others. And what we see here is that oftentimes people don't meet criteria. When they do, you need 2 symptoms to be met in order to meet a diagnostic criteria of at least mild. And we see that when people do meet a diagnostic threshold, it is typically mild to moderate. And then when we look at the individual symptoms, which is absolutely very critical, we see that a lot of these symptoms are characteristic of what we call physical dependence, which is defined by the tolerance or withdrawal. And that could be using to avoid withdrawal. So again, when I drank my coffee this morning, if I didn't drink my coffee, I was gonna get very fatigued, I was gonna get a headache. That is a withdrawal symptom. So we do know, I believe at this point it's very fair to say that using daily use of kratom or regular use of kratom will lead to these withdrawal or tolerance symptoms, but they are described as fairly manageable and mild and moderate in nature. I'm actually doing a supervised withdrawal study at Hopkins, and we are looking at physiological and every other way of assessing withdrawal. That's what we're doing right now. So going and picking up kind of where Chris had mentioned, risky or safe or dangerous. So we have very few published case reports on kratom-related morbidities and mortalities. It is a shockingly small number, and I have read every single one of them, right? And so we don't have a lot globally, and we have a few pharmacokinetic studies. Of these studies, which I don't have time to get into, no serious adverse events occurred. We did have some GI upset, which again, given the plant material, is almost understandable because it's kind of pungent. I do want to touch on the FDA single ascending dose study very quickly. I cannot read this far, and I didn't. So this setup, I'm gonna wing it here. We're gonna see how well I do for those of you who can actually read this better. But FDA did get up to 12 grams across 8 cohorts. So this is 40 healthy adults, and within each cohort, there were 6 who received kratom and 2 who received placebo. Again, no serious adverse events. This is a big deal, right? This is part of how we define safety. Of the adverse events, vomiting was the only one that occurred at a rate greater than placebo, and it was when healthy volunteers took 8 grams or more. And that's a lot of material to consume. If you're not a daily kratom consumer and you take 8 grams of anything, that's a lot of material. And so the fact that that was the only adverse effect that differed from placebo is really interesting, and it's also in keeping with what we saw in other studies of where adverse events were observed, which were GI upset. They did not see strong indicators of abuse potential. This is not an abuse potential study. They are moving forward with that because they have found that this is safe and well tolerated. And so I should also note too that they did not have strong indicators within that abuse potential paradigm. In this drug effects questionnaire is what they used, of feeling intoxicated or high. And that's in keeping with what, at NIDA, when I was a postdoc there, we did a small sub-study, and we had 10 kratom consumers come in. They took their own product at their own self-selected doses between 1.1 and 10.9 grams. No adverse events, and there's a lot of ecological validity here. So the FDA study, that was a well-characterized kratom material, these folks are taking whatever they're buying, right? So this is not, we're not selecting what is an ideal standard. We are seeing what actually is going on. And unlike FDA, we did find some higher ratings of liking which I think is interesting because, and actually not surprising, because if people are using Kratom daily, obviously they like it. So there's a question of, what abuse potential indicators would be found, again, among Kratom-naive consumers, and it might not be that high. We did not see intoxication. We did not see impairment, and that's both subjective report as well as objective psychomotor tasks. And in participant interviews, we did get some signals of serotonin excess, and that's important. So speciogynin and penanthine, yeah, sorry, I'm not the chemist, but we know that there are some alkaloids that act on serotonin receptors. And a lot of people Google Kratom and they get opioid that pops up at them. And that really, really irritates me. I do not like the internet when that happens because Kratom is not an opioid. And there's opioid activity, but there's so much else going on with this botanical. And I do think, what we are following up on is assessing the serotonergic excess possibility at Hopkins now. It is something that we do think everyone should be aware of. It's not a danger at this point, but it's something that needs further investigation. And I should note that when people did describe having unpleasant events with Kratom, none of them sought medical attention. So that's probably a reason why we don't have more published case reports, because a lot of people are not seeking medical care. Last slide, this is a bunch of stuff just shoved onto one slide, and it's what everyone loves. They love the driving simulator. So I wanted to show the driving simulator. We have, this is a machine that is validated to detect impairment with alcohol, cannabis, and we've had people before and after they consume their Kratom get into this driving simulator, and we really did not see any indicator of impairment. We had one participant who had some slight increase in standard deviation of lateral position and a lower coherence score, which is for that one specific task of many, many outcomes. That one participant did show a slight decline. Everyone else, there was no trend in any direction. Some people improved and some people stayed kind of steady. So again, we do need to follow up on this, particularly with Kratom-naive consumers and higher potency products, because a Kratom-naive consumer could have a different outcome. And I really hope this is the last slide. It is. So takeaways is that Kratom, still a harm reduction tool, but really increasingly used for recreation, fitness, quality of life, wanting to feel good, wanting to have energy. The abuse potential remains unknown. We know that physical dependence is part of daily Kratom use, but it seems to be well managed. And really, I do think, I've kind of hit all of these notes, so I'm just going to end with this. We need more investment in scientific research. We really need FDA, we need NIDA, we need more investment in research while regulation plays out, because I don't think we believe Kratom should be prohibited. I'm not coming again at this as a pharmaceutical, but more as a product. And in my opinion, this should be in the marketplace, but it needs to be regulated. It needs to have more investment in research. And with that, I will hand the clicker to Dr. Boyer.